Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen here real quick. Hopefully this will work properly. Okay, hopefully you can see the first slide of my presentation, Teaching in the Metaverse. Is that true? Great. I apologize for having to leave early. The dean of my school requested my presence, and since she's the one who has been funding some of my VR initiatives, I cannot say no to my dean. So I will be presenting a portion of the talk that I gave at the CUNY IT conference. So apologies if you've seen, if this is familiar to you, but I assume most of the people in this room have not seen it. And I don't want to waste any time, so I'm just going to jump in. I'll be reading off prepared notes, so I won't be looking directly at the camera, but I'll just dive in. So a bit about myself. My name is Jason Moore, and I'm an associate professor of emerging media at Brooklyn College. I'm a cross-platform storyteller with over 30 years of experience as a director of theater, film, television, and virtual reality. For the past 5 years, I have focused exclusively on storytelling in VR, and thus I have gained some valuable experience with VR technology in general. At Brooklyn College, I teach in the Department of Television, Radio, and Emerging Media, and my classes include traditional television directing, as well as storytelling for virtual reality. Today, the topic of my talk is Teaching in the Metaverse, Intimate Remote Instruction is Possible. In the talk, I will introduce the basic concepts and methodologies of using virtual reality technologies inside the emerging metaverse in order to create deeply immersive, intimate educational experiences in a fully remote learning environment. An alternate title for this talk could have been How I Learned to Ditch Zoom in Order to Give Myself and my students a More Engaging Class. I will assume that everyone has heard at least of the term virtual reality, and by now probably the metaverse, but I won't rush through any of this. Using my own class as a case study, I will argue that utilizing virtual reality technology allows us to create a far superior remote educational experience for our students than Zoom. At Brooklyn College during the pandemic, the school did an admirable job of outfitting our students with required technology. Any student who needed a laptop or a tablet could borrow one for the semester. So our first obstacle was removed, and that is a good thing. But there are many other obstacles to remote learning. Reliable internet and quiet private spaces still need to be addressed. Some of these, in fact, cannot even be mitigated. Under this set of circumstances, however, synchronous instruction can be greatly improved upon. Consider that nearly every synchronous remote class is taught using Zoom in combination with asynchronous methods using Blackboard, discussion boards, and homework. We all have a million Zoom stories, and most of them are not positive ones. While Zoom did allow us to connect in real time with our students, we faced a plethora of challenges. Zoom feels impersonal, cold, and unfamiliar. Students are unaccustomed to a conference call style of communication. They don't realize how important having the video on is. They are shy about revealing their home space. They cannot have a natural conversation with peers in any way or time, not before class, not during it, not on a break, not after. Zoom is very formal. Zoom allows you to self-distract, surfing the web, playing a game. You can literally do anything but pay attention, and a professor won't really know. It's hard to have a spontaneous or natural discussion, and students are easily distracted. Even presenting visual material like video is problematic. With stuttering playback, video compression artifacts, it's hard to see and hear. Slideshows feel even more stale than they do in a classroom. Zoom ultimately is not a good way to deliver robust, intimate, personal, and engaging live education. But what if there were some alternative technology that is affordable, accessible, and that offers a vastly superior learning environment? What if there was a tool that could bring the professor and the students together in a meaningful way? Well, there is. Virtual reality. VR in the metaverse is a hot topic at the moment, and rightfully so. It is a very important step in society. Using VR in the metaverse allows us to be together in a shared virtual space where communication feels more natural, real, and intimate. When teaching in a virtual classroom using VR headsets, a professor and their students can more closely simulate the natural learning environment we are all used to. And actually, it can even improve on it. VR hardware has been around since 2014 and even much earlier. We are currently in the early stages of mass adoption of VR, but most of you are probably aware of two things. Facebook has recently changed its name to Meta and declared that they will be investing billions into the metaverse. And you have probably seen an ad or two for this, the Quest headset. The Quest headset is a wireless standalone device that delivers extremely high quality VR images and sound at a very affordable price point. Meta is selling these units at well below costs for obvious reasons. They want you to use their metaverse. But for educators, it's a tool that is hard to say no to. For a fraction of the cost of a laptop, we can have a device that allows us to deliver an educational experience that feels like it belongs in a science fiction novel. At the beginning of the pandemic, I presented my college with a proposal. I told them that I could offer a high quality remote educational experience that would be vastly superior to a traditional Zoom class if they would simply purchase 15 Quest headsets. For $4,500 investment, I said that not only could we use this equipment to teach a one-of-a-kind virtual class, I told them we could use this gear over and over again each semester, giving us the ability to offer many sets of students a highly intimate and exciting remote class experience. As a leader of emerging technology, my college trusted and supported me, and soon I was in possession of 15 Quest headsets. As the pandemic hit, Brooklyn College was shut down with no in-person classes, and in fact, nobody even allowed on campus. I met students and distributed the Quest devices, and soon they had learned the basics. Our first few classes were on Zoom. As I introduced them to social VR, showed them how to run the various apps on their Quest, and made sure everyone understood where we were going. Then we actually started meeting in virtual reality. Instead of starting a Zoom call, we each put on our headsets, launched a social VR application. In this case, we were using AltSpace VR, and we then met in a virtual classroom. We began each class by standing in a big circle and having a natural conversation about our lives, dealing with COVID, managing other classes and work, just getting a feel for what it's like to be in a shared virtual space with 15 other people. While it takes an adjustment to wearing a headset and using controls, we all quickly moved past the technology and were soon able to have focused lectures and discussions around the topics of the class. Students were far more engaged in VR than on a Zoom call. They laughed and joked with each other and with me. Their energy level was high, engagement and focus were high. With no other screens to distract, no cell phones to peek at, and with the magical tools of VR in their hands, it was obvious to everyone that this learning environment was vastly superior to our Zoom room. Teaching students how to use the Quest and how to use social VR was straightforward. Once we spent some time together, we quickly recreated actually, the social environment of a normal classroom. Me telling students to quiet down so class could begin. I would give a lecture, then initiate a discussion with students asking questions, just like a real classroom. But really, this was just the beginning. Things got much more interesting from there. With everyone onboarded and feeling comfortable with the tech, I showed the students how to use virtual presentation tools to share their work. Students use virtual PowerPoint slideshows to present their research. They use virtual media players to screen videos and audio. They use virtual whiteboards to collaborate and brainstorm. And because we are using computer-generated worlds and tools, students could interact with 3D objects. So rather than show a slide of, say, a slide of DNA, they could actually hold a model of it, rotate it, and look into it, pass it around the room, even scale it bigger or smaller. Soon I started taking them on virtual field trips to other spaces in AltSpace. We discussed the Mars rover while standing on Mars and operating a virtual rover. We talked about ancient Greece while standing in a virtual Parthenon. We explored the International Space Station in zero-G. And because VR platforms are used globally, the ability to meet and interact with international users is just a matter of working out time zones. Soon, I was able to coordinate a meetup between my class and another college professor and his students located in Utrecht in the Netherlands. Luckily for us, his students were fluent in English. We arranged a co-teaching lecture with both classes, with he and I taking turns teaching to the entire group. And then we led the two groups of students in several collaborative learning sessions where they met, interviewed, and learned from and about each other. It was the next best thing to getting on a plane and flying my class to Europe. Only it was totally free and easy, and we all got to do it from the comfort of our home, even while our respective countries' travel bans prevented us from physically visiting each other, In conclusion, it is my belief that the future of online remote education is clear. Virtual reality, social VR, and the metaverse offers us tools that cannot be ignored. I hope I did not go over my time.
That was perfect. I'm going to give you the live applause. Everybody can also unmute themselves and you see it from the room. Thank you so much, Jason.
My pleasure.
That is really, I mean, amazing. And I'm very happy to introduce two colleagues at the School of Nursing who I've had the pleasure to meet in person earlier this semester. Yes, we get to meet up again and see each other, not in a Zoom box, who will talk to us about simulation. And so at the School of Nursing, there's a simulation lab. I saw abbreviations like VSim, so I'm assuming that stands for virtual simulation. So for many of us, that's a completely different approach and a new world. And I'm very happy that Alex Plavskin is here, who is an assistant dean for academic operations and the adjunct faculty coordinator at the School of Nursing, and is together with Barbara Ravida, who is the associate dean for undergraduate programs. Also, as if they don't have enough to do, also the coordinators for the simulation trainings at the School of Nursing. So with that, I pass it over to Alex.
Thank you so much. And Barbara's very sorry. She was on earlier, but she had to run and help with something. So I'm going to go share my screen. And hello, Natasha. Natasha and I were at the Graduate Center at the same time together. So it's a very small world. It's very nice to see you. So let me talk a little bit about VSim for nursing specifically to kind of bring us back to the virtual world. So the background for VSim, it was developed in partnership with Lippincott William Wilkins, who was, a publishing magnate, and the National League for Nursing, as well as Laerdal. And Laerdal does quite a bit of work in simulation in construction of mannequins for simulation. So they're meant to be like patients, but they also have a slew of educational technology that they also produce. So these are peer-reviewed scenarios that are available through VSim. They're adapted for virtual simulation. So they were basically clinical cases that were previously developed and peer-reviewed and then adapted for the virtual world. And their goal was to develop an innovative and immersive educational technology. They did begin early pilot testing in about 2014, 2015. So this wasn't something that they kind of, put together hastily in 2020. This was something that they were moving towards kind of, as part of their repertoire. So for us, many of us, March 2020. So what happened for us, everything was just so precipitous. It happened so quickly. One clinical agency contacted us. At the time, the news was saying maybe there's 13, 15 cases in New York City. Nobody's really sure. And one clinical agency called us. We had a call with them and they said, no more students. The students can no longer attend. And of course, to us, we thought, that's safe. At the time, we were thinking, people who are ill with COVID are going to the clinical settings, and those clinical institutions don't want to bring the students to those same areas. Little did we know, that this would be something that was prevalent all throughout New York City and then the country thereafter. So what happened was one clinical agency said no more students, and then almost the next day, the other 50 clinical agencies said no more students. So the shutdown was very rapid for us, and the focus was to move quickly, but most importantly, to maintain quality as we move to online learning. So for us, we're a big program. We have 400, this is only undergraduate students, and the senior students have 2 clinical experiences. So that means that there's 500 individual clinical experiences every single week with 70 instructors. And the instructors are predominantly adjunct faculty instructors. They usually, they're clinicians. So they're experts in clinical practice. They work a clinical job, and then usually once a week, they teach as adjunct faculty for us. So this was a very new educational modality for a very large group of people. The students are quite handy with new technology, but this was a really stressful time and the students were anxious. They still had a slew of questions as we were trying to educate them about vSim. vSim was also new for us, so we had to learn it very quickly and then begin to support the students and especially support our adjunct faculty. And adjunct faculty, they live out in the real world. They go to healthcare institutions and they work. They don't sit in front of their computers the same way that we do. They're not as comfortable with a lot of technology. They're not checking their email all the time if we send out instructions or questions. So this was something where we really had to support two unique groups, the students and then the instructors as well. And of course, we can't talk about Zoom without talking about Zoom fatigue. Lectures moved to Zoom, but at the same time, we thought, how could we move an 8-hour clinical day to Zoom also? Talk about Zoom fatigue. You can't just stare at somebody's, over the screen for 8 hours and talk about case studies. We need to do something better for the students. We didn't want to just stop at Zoom. So we turned to vSim, as did many other schools of nursing. I'm going to show you a video to make this a little bit clear, because the images that they present are a little bit low resolution, but let me talk about it and then I'll go to a different screen. So I think for me, the best part of vSim is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And it's broken up into these digestible components, because the same way that you don't want students sitting on Zoom for 6 hours. And the reason I keep saying 6 or 8 hours is because a clinical experience is usually when a nursing student would go to a rotation in the hospital and they would work with a nurse who is their instructor, and they would work with the other staff on the unit. And those rotations are usually between 6 to 8 hours for each time that they have their rotation. So we had this kind of large experience that we had to fill, and we wanted to make it meaningful. And the same way that you don't want to have a student sit on Zoom for 6 to 8 hours, you don't want to give a student reading to do for 6 to 8 hours. So one of the things that I think is really great about vSim is that it puts together these different educational modalities. So the students do have suggested reading, and this is kind of like background reading. And the vSims, they're focused on a variety of subject areas. So you can have, let's say, women's health, pediatrics, psychiatric mental health, adult health, geriatrics, community. And then within that kind of subgroup, you can have clinical cases that are pertinent to that subgroup. So if you're talking about pediatrics, maybe you have an asthma case, maybe you have a diabetes case, maybe you have a growth and development case. So there are kind of individual cases within each subject group. So for the individual case itself, there would be the background reading. Then there's the simulation pre-quiz. And so I think that this is also very important, because sometimes students will be like, oh yeah, I understand everything about asthma. I'm ready. And then they take the pre-quiz and they say, oh, maybe I should go back and redo my reading. There's some things that I'm really missing. And the pre-simulation quiz is low stakes. So this is something that it's not graded, just pass or fail, and just to give the students an idea. And I think also that's very important. You can't have everything be high stakes in a learning situation. The vSim itself, I'll show an image of it actually. Why don't we go ahead and do that now? The other thing about the vSim is the students can do it as many times as they'd like. It is graded in the sense that they have to hit certain key indicators, like they have to come in, wash their hands, they have to identify the patient, they have to, depending on what the case is, if it's an asthma case, they have to perform a respiratory assessment, depending on what the findings are, they have to do one thing or another thing. And so what the students see, it is an immersive learning environment. I think that's very important for the students to kind of envision themselves in an area that looks like a clinical setting. There is, a patient that they're speaking to that is responsive, and then they click from these tabs. So there's safety measures, communication, assessments, and then inside this assessment tab, for example, it breaks into the different types of assessments. There are interventions, there are medications that could be administered, and then tests and diagnostics they can review. So this is just to kind of show everybody in a little bit more of a clear image. And then they could click through the tabs and click and do different things. They do receive a grade. For us, we put the minimum grade at 80%. It doesn't have to be perfection. We want to make sure that they learn, they do their best, but they can also do the vSim as many times as they'd like. If they want to go ahead and do it 20 times, they absolutely can. That's another, I think, strong component of vSim. There's also a post-simulation quiz, and this one they do receive an actual grade on. And again, I think that this is also important because sometimes students can kind of, skim and get key takeaways, but I think it's great for them to have that that number to show them how much of this information did I understand versus how much did I not. And for us, clinical is a pass or fail component of the class. So as long as the students were meeting that 80% and above, this is something where they could learn in a safe environment. And if they were getting 80% and they were meeting the minimum requirement, it wouldn't necessarily bring down their grade if, let's say, they had a B+ in the lecture or an A- in the lecture. And then again, to kind of break it up into different educational modalities, there's a documentation assignment. It's very important for nurses to document accurately, concisely, and correctly. And then there is a guided reflection questions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So for us, the benefits of vSim, it is immersive. It looks like a healthcare facility, which helps students visualize themselves taking care of a real client. We have this kind of no hiding policy. And so what I mean by that, this is a photo of a simulation and you have 3 students. So one student is administering fluids, one student is starting an IV, one student is performing an abdominal assessment. And then you have the student that is the least comfortable in simulation always just kind of tends to fade into the background until they're usually like behind a large object. And they don't mean to do this. We see it over and over with simulation. It's just something that has to do with maybe their lack of confidence, or they're not really sure where they fit in. They don't want to, come out and say something. They're worried that it's wrong. And so the student that needs the most help and needs the most participation tends to fade into the background. When you have vSim, every single action is done by the participant. So everybody who's doing a vSim is going to be administering fluid, starting an IV, doing an assessment. So there's no hiding. All the participants are fully engaged. And the feedback is provided for every student. So for example, if this student is giving IV fluids in a simulation that is in person, then this student wouldn't get feedback on how she administered IV fluids. So it has that multi-component structure, which I mentioned. So instead of a Zoom session that just tends to go on forever, there's background reading, there's a low stakes quiz, the vSim can be repeated many times, and then there's the post quiz. And then the debriefing. So for us, the debriefing is the most important part of simulation. And what debriefing is when everybody gets together at the end of simulation and says, all right, let's go over what happened. What actions did you select? Why? How do you think the patient responded? Do you think that was the best outcome? What else could we have done? And that's guided by the instructor. And that's really where students make the most connections and get the most key takeaways. And the instructor can talk about alternate actions the students had taken, or maybe additional context, such as, well, what if the student was also on this? What if the patient was also on this medication? Or what if the patient also had this comorbidity? And they kind of start to put the puzzle pieces together. So for us, we did that last component, that final component where there were guided questions with the instructor, because we really feel like we need the instructor to help the students put the pieces together at this time. And we weren't the only ones that felt this way. New York State, after spring 2020, would only approve vSim to replace clinical hours, and only during COVID surges, if debriefing with the instructor was part of the experience. We couldn't assign vSim like a homework assignment and just have it be a freestanding homework assignment. And if the student got an 80 or above, that's fine. So they wanted more from us, and we wanted more from us too. So this is where we were even before we spoke to the state. So there are downsides to vSim, as there are with anything. There's a little bit of choice paralysis. There are a lot of options, and they all look like maybe something that you'd want to do. They all look like they're promoting patient safety. They all look like they're educating the patient. And sometimes the students just get confused and they say, but all of these things look correct to me. And sometimes I agree with the students. I think that it can be a little bit confusing, especially when you first start. So in a more realistic scenario, sometimes all of those things would be appropriate to do. The grading system is a little bit rigid in vSims. So for example, kind of what I said before is if you came in and you were doing an in-person simulation and the student wanted to do 3 items, and I would think, okay, all those items seem appropriate to me. Maybe vSim was really looking for something else specifically, or only 2 out of those 3 items, and it would penalize the student as far as their grade if they didn't follow the structure. So to me, it was a little bit more structured than I would have liked, but I do think that these kind of, virtual scenarios, especially clinical scenarios, are kind of in their beginning phases. I think they're going to become more advanced as the algorithms become more responsive. There is a shortcut. The shortcut is to come in, do your VSIM, do as poorly as you can, and then look at the feedback, and the feedback will tell you everything you should do, and then do it a second time following the feedback. So that's another reason why it's really, really important that we do that debriefing with the instructor, because the instructor can speak to the student. And if a student got an 85, but the student seems to have absolutely no idea what the simulation was about, maybe there was a little bit of a shortcut that was taken. Cost. It is not inexpensive. It's about $80 per student. And again, we have a large program, so it is a significant cost. It's not $80 per case. You get I think about 10 cases per subject matter, but it's still not an insignificant cost. For nursing, psychomotor skill development is really important. If you're talking about administering medications, you can watch endless videos on how to administer an injection. You can do a virtual case about how to administer injection until you get to touch a needle, and until you get to, we also have kind of physical mannequins, and we have injection pads that can be used in the lab. Until you get to touch a needle, touch a syringe, draw up the fluid, is just not exactly the same. And we've had that happen a lot, where we had really strong students who did all the background reading, they did all the associated case studies, they would come into the nursing lab, they would draw up the medication, a syringe, the fluid would spray everywhere, and they would say, why did that happen? And until you really get your hands on those syringes and needles, it's really hard to know. So touching anatomical landmarks, performing those physical skills for nursing and for healthcare, that's really invaluable. And my last slide. So where are we now? So the ultimate goal of simulation, the reason that healthcare providers talk so much about simulation, both in education and clinical practice, is it's a safe learning environment. So the example that I give is, if I'm with the nursing students and I'm their clinical instructor at the hospital, and there's a patient that is having an acute cardiac event, I'm not going to put the students forward and say, this is a great learning opportunity. What's going to happen is, if there's a true emergency, I'm going to step forward, and the healthcare providers at the institution will step forward. But then if that keeps occurring during emergencies, how can the students transition from their student role to their independent provider role? And so a safe learning environment, one where a patient can't be harmed and one where the student is safe also, is the best opportunity for them to gain a little bit more independence in these really complex situations. And that's where simulation is ultimately so invaluable. Right now for us, we've moved back to more of an in-person model. Part of the reason is we thought that we did our absolute best during online learning, and we thought we were really innovative. And when we came back in person, all of our clinical instructors kept saying, what's with this group of students? Why are they at a lower learning level than the students that I'm used to? And we realized that there's just certain things that are a little bit irreplaceable as far as doing things in person for healthcare. And so as COVID becomes endemic, we don't really know what that will look like, because every year is a new year for us in a sense. We had our first Delta year, we had our first Omicron year. So if COVID surges tend to come in the cold months, what we're doing now is, while we can be in person, we're trying to do a lot of in-person instruction, with the thought that maybe in the fall and winter months, there might be times where the hospitals say, maybe no students for now. And then we'd utilize more online instruction. So we're kind of trying to be flexible. All of us are trying to be flexible, try to provide the students the best experiences, because we never know what the future will bring. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you. That was so insightful and so great to hear how you, of all schools and programs, had to respond to a very difficult situation, both on the workplace and in the training. very insightful. And I heard the word flexible, and that's really what we all have to keep doing, but it seems like you have a great system in place. I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to ask people just to, you can put your questions in the chat for Alex in the meantime, but I'm going to introduce our final presenter for today, who is Ricardo Miranda, who is a professor in film and media at Hunter, and is also the acting chair of the department right now. So we are double thankful that he is joining us today and sharing more on his work in VR, and like Jason, is really a longtime practitioner of virtual reality. So Ricardo, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. I think I can be pretty quick. So I direct the Emerging Media program. It's a concentration in the Department of Film and Media Studies. And over the past year, I've been teaching a production course titled XR Design and Development, in which we delve into something called A-Frame, which is a JavaScript framework that works within the browser. And we use that both for AR and VR. And we also get into Spark AR Studio, which is to create filters, augmented reality filters for Instagram and Facebook. But I really try to get the students to think critically and try to think about how could these filters be used to, say, create a questionnaire or create something that delves into social issues. And then the majority of the semester is spent in the Unity game engine. And one can use that game engine both for augmented reality and virtual reality, as well as creating mobile applications and desktop applications. I tend to be very critical of emerging technologies, and personally, I would never recommend that anybody wear a VR headset longer than 20 minutes. I find that to be the longest time that one should be within, looking in this very small space. And I don't feel that virtual education can really replicate in-person education. I taught this course last spring entirely online, and I'm teaching it in person this semester, and the in-person exchange between the students and them sitting together and exchanging ideas just doesn't come nearly as, it's not as powerful as, or I'm saying the in-person scenario is much more powerful than the virtual, or even when having conversations and exchanging ideas. That said, I love adopting creative technologies for to see where they can be pushed and what can be done. So my department has a strong documentary and journalism programs, which dovetail nicely with my own creative practice, as I tend to investigate social issues through inquiry and interviews with specialists, and then try to find innovative platforms to present that work. And over the last few years, I've been presenting documentary material such as interviews in virtual worlds as an artistic medium. And that's how I approach my classes. So I'm gonna I'll share my screen and share the class that I'm talking about. So just quickly to look at the syllabus, this is the class where students start off with A-Frame, the JavaScript framework, which works in the browser. And then we move into Spark AR and finally Unity. The Spark AR period is very short. It's mostly my own hangups with Meta, so-called Meta, or Facebook, and the way and all the things all the issues that come with Facebook. So I have students create a series of exercises. Those exercises feed into actual projects. We'll look at an A-frame environment. This is this is from last semester, a student created. I have them conduct interviews with peers for this project and for other projects. So this project, Trans at CUNY, is the experience of being trans. And I'm gonna, so in this environment.
22.
There's bathrooms, mailbox, computer, and there are
public schools in a bit.
it might be too low to hear from my computer. I'm playing the audio from my computer, but it's using 3D audio, so you can hear the interview sequences and the difficulties for trans students, for example, to have to decide between only going to a women's bathroom or a men's bathroom, and just yeah, those conflicts. I will share a project. This is from a current student who will be graduating this spring, and their focus of the interviews was going into the labor force, figuring out what lays ahead. So the student conducted interviews with people of also in their 20s, and the thing I love about A-Frame, which does require HTML, CSS, and some, you can do a lot just with very basic JavaScript. But what I love about it is that it doesn't require one to download an app. You can run it through the browser. There is a button down here. You can see this BR button that one can toggle if you're in an Oculus headset or some other headset. All these headsets come with browsers. So this world, you could be entirely in it instead of looking at it from this, in this 2D panel. So the interviews that the student conducted are actually over these cubes, and one hovers.
10 years of experience when I'm 21 years old, graduating out of college. 3 professional references when, again, I just graduated college. like I don't understand how that's supposed to work. And they don't want internship references. They want like real job pay stub references. It's just,
and the internships don't want to hire you anyway.
Exactly.
So I don't know if people can hear that, but they're lamenting the difficulties of going out into the workforce and being expected to have job experience, but they have to get started. So those are a couple examples from using A-Frame. I'm going to share a project that I'm currently working on using the Unity game engine. And so as I mentioned, with this particular application, you can build out both to a computer as a self-contained application, or to Oculus or Steam, or these many different platforms. So this project is called FinTech for the Precariat. And as I mentioned, I like doing interviews with specialists. So when I approach these courses, I approach it from the perspective of storytelling. And I try to get the students to think about critical issues or social issues that they are living. And as you saw with those examples, I asked them to conduct interviews with peers, family, or friends, and have those interviews help them construct the environments that they create. So again, that's for my own practice. And so this project I started during the pandemic, and it was thinking about emerging financial technologies and questioning who ultimately is getting wealthy from these financial technologies. I'm thinking about things like Robinhood, which facilitates anybody to start investing and making us all into investors, and where our money goes. So this project is partly scripted. I hired a narrator, and then embedded in the virtual world are interviews. So I'll just show a couple minutes of this and then wrap up.
FinTech for the Precariat, a pandemic journey through the many realities of finance. Welcome to the age of Bezos. In spring 2020, COVID-19 compounded existential insecurity. The pandemic of stress was inseminated by the novel flu virus to birth a new reality, a chasm of uncertainty. As unemployment soared in 2020, speculative futures drove a stock market that quickly rebounded from the initial shock. But on what basis? Could it be the expectation that this moment would soon pass and the age of plutocrats and technocrats will continue thriving? The slight disruption soon forgotten. The agenda of economic growth must be embraced at the cost of human health. After all, those who enjoy the economic growth will remain safely at home in their condo or mansion or rural cabin.
Okay, so we know that like financialization is just like completely destroying what's left of our society. The people who are most invested emotionally, psychically invested in finance, maybe their attitude is, what if we make everyone like us? I think that responsibility needs to lie where the power lies. If individuals are being exploited in a way, or they're being told one story, right, and getting hyped up and being filled with dreams of a better future for themselves and their families, ultimately, it would be quite easy for them to make a lot of mistakes. It's like the housing crisis, right? No income, no asset loans. Was it those individuals? Should they have signed up for those loans that they really couldn't pay? No, they shouldn't have signed up for the loans. But was there like an incredible concerted effort on behalf of people who really did know better to get them to sign those loans? Yes, those are the people that are responsible.
So at any point you can leave the interview.
While the masses exist in uncertainty.
Here we're moving into Wall Street, and I'll let this start and then stop.
Welcome to the world of state-approved insider trading, where the denizens accept that insiders can leverage public markets to make millions, even billions in a few days. Merely hype the stock or altcoin and use retail investors to bid up the price. Deception prevails even at the highest level, while anyone who tries to spoil the fun pays the price. Scanning markets for dodgy activity.
Okay, so in this application, it's a world building application. You can purchase packages such as I did for the cityscape, but you can also build a terrain and texture it with whatever JPEG or PNG you wish, such as this is something I made in Photoshop, and then textured this landscape, which is supposed to be reflective of Wall Street. I used an iPad Pro that has a LiDAR scanner to scan the bull. Went there at very early in the morning before the sun was up in the sky to scan the bull and Fearless Girl, as well as these barriers. And this is something that we do in class. And then the audio interviews are triggered by when one picks up these kind of floating spheres that I was carrying for one interview. And at any point they can throw the sphere and the interview will stop. And right now I have it muted, but the narrator would be once again speaking. So I'm gonna quit out of the project. Oops, I'm gonna exit. And you can see some of the interviewees. I hired a 3D artist, there's a narrator, a sound artist, and I'll stop the share. So that's the kind of work that I'm producing as an artist, but it's also the kind of work that I try to push the students to create, to just question technologies, to question things, but also use technology as a mode of storytelling and hopefully engagement with other people to get further discussion going. So.